Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2722 of The Tom Woods Show. We are kicking off 2026 with the great Darryl Cooper. And, you know, they sometimes say you know a man by his friends, but in many cases, you really know him by his enemies, let's face it. And I would say Darryl Cooper passes both of those with flying colors. He's the host of the Martyr Made podcast, as well as co-host with Scott Horton of the fantastic new Provoked podcast. So there's a lot of Darryl Cooper material out there. Darryl, welcome back.
Always great to be here, Tom, and very honored to be part of the first show of the new Tom Woods year.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know, I like to try to welcome. Yeah, I know it's arbitrary. I know, as Bono says, nothing changes on New Year's Day. I've heard the song, but I'm a sentimental old coot, you know, and I like to welcome the new year with optimism. So I don't know, maybe that'll be ground out of me by the time we're done talking. But can you talk to us first before we go into some of the issues that are driving you and me crazy? Your project, The Germans' War, what it's all about?
Sure. Yeah. So I do a long form history podcast, and sometimes I'll pick a topic and I'll do a one-off episode on it. Other times I'll pick one that requires, 6, 7, 8 episodes, 25, 30, 40 hours to go through the entire thing. And so I decided to do a series on the Second World War told from the perspective of the Germans, which, it sets off a lot of alarm bells for people who are sort of enmeshed in the post-war consensus. They hear that and they think automatically you're going to write a revisionist history sympathetic to the aims of the National Socialists or something like that. It's really not what this is about. Like, I'm really interested in the German people and what it is that they went through in the interwar period leading up to the Second World War, and then what they experienced, how things looked to them from their perspective during the war itself. It's there's this interesting like fact about history that I wrote the other day about why Jesus had to come from the Jews, right? And one of the reasons for that, I think, I'll tie this back to the World War II thing, I promise. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that the Jews were almost unique, and maybe back then they were completely unique in history as a people who didn't just record their great victories, but they recorded their disasters and catastrophes and failures with almost as much, probably more, emotional valence for the people themselves as they go through, whether it's the Babylonian exile or the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdoms, all these things. If you look at the way most history is written, you read about the rise of the Babylonians from the perspective of the Babylonians. We're great, we're awesome, our gods favor us, and we smashed our enemies. And then they get destroyed by the Assyrian, by the Persians. And you read about the destruction of the Babylonians from the perspective of the Persians. The defeats in history are generally always written by the people who beat them, the people who rose, their successors who came up after them and wrote about how these people deserved to lose. These people had it coming. They were bad, kind of worked them into a minor role in their own mythology, the victor's own mythology. And we have just a unique opportunity here, I think, in history, it's unique in history and for the subject of history, that we have so much data now, we have access to so much information, we can really go back and start to look at these things in a more realistic and human way. The story that we've gotten about the Second World War has been the story of the destruction of Babylon as told by the Achaemenid Persians. It's the story of the destruction of Jerusalem as told by the Roman emperors. And so you can go back and you can tell those stories from the perspective of the people who were there without having to justify what their war aims were, what their ideology was, or anything like that. Just try to get into why it made sense to them at the time, why that seemed like their best or only course of action at the time, and just try to understand that.
Now, I realize that I'm getting ahead of your story because you're starting at World War I, aren't you?
Got to. Yeah.
Got to, yeah. Yeah. But you are eventually, when, if this really is going to be the Germans' war, and you're going to talk about the ordinary Germans, you're going to have to, and I don't expect you to do it right now, but you're going to have to come to terms with that book by Daniel Goldhagen, almost 30 years ago now, Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which he more or less placed all wartime Germans in the nation as being, quote, willing executioners of Hitler. And now there were people who hit back at that book, but that was a very controversial, but very successful book at that time that does talk about ordinary Germans and casts them in a pretty unflattering light.
Sure. And, this is something that ever since we've entered the modern era of large-scale people's wars, ever since, say, the French Revolution, maybe, where war really wasn't, boutique mercenary armies or professional soldiers, fighting each other on a battlefield without really harassing the civilian population on either side so much necessarily, depending on the war. With World War I, we really came to the apotheosis of the nation state as an institution, where it reached its max level of just efficiency and ability to mobilize resources to act as a single entity on the world stage. And so you have these nation states that are pulling millions and millions of people to put up at the front. But then also, it requires a whole of society effort to run a war like that for any length of time. And so that was the era that we were in. And it's always a challenge to kind of try to figure out, to make it, take a more like modern example. You see a lot of people now, you go on Twitter and pretty much every day you're going to be bombarded with, pictures of Israeli soldiers in Gaza making joking sort of celebratory photographs, of themselves in a kindergarten that they just blew up or something. And you see things like this, and you see, even more, I guess, difficult to deal with are some of the videos, some of the tweets and other things that come from people who aren't the soldiers in Gaza. They're in Tel Aviv. They're on the home front, that are showing a level of support for actions that, our traditional way of thinking about these things is that the civilian population can't be held responsible for those things. That's the kind of thinking that makes it okay to blow up the World Trade Center, because, hey, we're a democracy. We vote for the politicians that go over there and send troops to the Middle East and kill Arabs and Muslims. And Osama bin Laden says, I'm at war with, the American people. And if you want to apply that logic really strictly, things get ugly very, very fast. That doesn't mean, though, necessarily that people are always without responsibility in trying to figure out, not really a share of responsibility, because I don't really think that's very fruitful to try to think, just try to cast blame or reframe the question of blame all these years later. It's really that, it's not, evil humans aren't in general the reasons that evil is perpetrated throughout history. There are some of those people, but really a lot of times you have normal people who are put into circumstances that turn them into something that they might not have become short of those circumstances, and trying to understand what those circumstances were and how the people who were experiencing them went through that and then came, to a place where they felt that something that, again, we look at today as being a very negative outcome, that was their best course of action or best way of approaching things. Trying to figure that out about other people helps us understand that kind of thing about ourselves, and we think that we're free of this kind of thing. We're really not. Go on Twitter today and look at the people who are cheering on, whether it's this war in Gaza, go back after 9/11 in Afghanistan or Iraq, go back to the people who were defending Lieutenant Calley after the My Lai massacre. You see those kinds of things and you say, wait, how did we get from guy who goes to work, comes home, kisses his wife, pats his kid on the head, says his prayers at night, and then goes out, and makes a public statement without shame that, some horrible, horrible atrocity that was carried out on the other side of the world is, is either justifiable or even something that we should be happy or celebrating. How is it that we tolerate our own politicians going and autographing bombs that they know are going to be dropped on kids? Like, how did we get to this place? And so I think that in the future, if somebody wanted to, when you look at things like the autographing of bombs by American politicians that are headed to Gaza, I mean, you could look and somebody could write a book called Netanyahu's Willing Executioners or some other version of that casts the same blame on us for all of the things that we tolerate and that we allow to happen under our watch, where we ostensibly actually have some level of political authority in our country, ostensibly, that the Germans didn't have, the ordinary German person didn't have in the 30s and 40s. And so I think just a level of humility and self-awareness is really necessary if we really want to try to understand history as anything other than a mythology.
I want to send you, I'll send you the link, an article that the late Ralph Raico wrote about the Goldhagen book and how it demonizes the Germans, which has been an easy thing for the world to do for a very long time, because it's worth taking a look at it. But we really felt the loss of Ralph Raico. He was not a prolific writer by any means, but he knew so much, and I wish he had written more. I know a lot of people like that who are really brilliant people, but I wish they would share with us something that will, like the work that you do, outlive you and benefit us for the years to come. But this is certainly an article I want you to see. Now, speaking of articles, you mentioned recently on your so-called X feed an article I had totally forgotten about, but once you mentioned it, I remembered it immediately. And that is the Christopher Hitchens article from Vanity Fair over 20 years ago called Rumble on the Right. And your note about it was to say, first of all, people should read this article. And secondly, to note that in case you thought that this quote-unquote civil war going on the right was something new, read this article, because the dividing line is exactly the same. The arguments and accusations are exactly the same. But I think the difference, well, I'm going to ask you in a minute what the difference is. Let me read, if I may, briefly from David Frum, who's quoted in this article. And then I'm going to read from Pat Buchanan responding to Frum, also quoted in the article. Here's David Frum. There is a fringe attached to the conservative world that cannot overcome its despair and alienation. The resentments are too intense, the bitterness too unappeasable. Only the boldest of them as yet explicitly acknowledge their wish to see the United States defeated in the war on terror. But they are thinking about defeat and wishing for it, and they will take pleasure in it if it should happen. This is what he's saying about his opponents. He says, they began by hating the neoconservatives. They came to hate their party and this president. They have finished by hating their country. War is a great clarifier. It forces people to take sides. The paleo-conservatives have chosen, and the rest of us must choose too. In a time of danger, they have turned their backs on their country. Now we turn our backs on them. Sounds like it could have been written yesterday. And
it's very ironic that coming from a guy who wouldn't become an American citizen for 4 more years after that article was written. It's really offensive, to be honest with you, to have a guy like that saying things about Pat Buchanan. I think Justin Raimondo was in that article that he denounced him as well. It's really offensive.
Yeah, but beyond offensive, it also just it's surprise. I mean, because you and I would never act that way. I wouldn't go to some other country and ostentatiously lecture them about their shortcomings or whatever. I mean, or that some people aren't patriotic in the right way. It would never even dawn on me to act that way. I mean, it's the gall, dare I say the chutzpah of these people, that you would act that way. And you would make accusations like that. And when no one would, I would never act that way. Never occurred to me.
Hitchens actually, I'm pretty sure it's in that 2004 Vanity Fair article. He talks about how, this whole thing of calling your opponents terrorists, calling them Nazis, like all of that. This was not, look, politicians go after each other. There's a lot of dirty tricks and various things like that. It was understood you did not do that until relatively recently. And it was the people like David Frum who really brought that into the mainstream of our political discourse. Like, they've degraded it, to an extreme degree that is very unfortunate, and I don't know if necessary, if it happened because of the rise of the neoconservatives themselves, or if just the culture itself was coarsening, ever since the 1960s, and the old WASP elite that kind of maintained a certain level of propriety and standards in political discourse started to sort of lose their grip and fade away, and it became more of a free-for-all. There's probably a lot of causes behind it, but there's no doubt that one of the primary perpetrators, the primary groups of people who are responsible for dragging us down in terms of our discourse, has been the neocons, because they do, that there's not even, people who are watching this probably already agree, but even people who are totally on side with the Israelis' narrative of the Gaza war, even they, I think it's somewhere in their own heart have to look, and they have to admit that, the people who are in favor of it, I've never even seen them try to make an argument. I really haven't. It's you're a bad person if you don't agree with me. The reason you don't agree with me is these bad motives that I'm assuming about you. There's absolutely no point by point, break it down. Here's why this is important, that we support this, and that da-da-da. They don't even bother trying that. They understand politics in terms of marketing and advertising, and in our mass media and especially internet world, that's kind of what it is and what it's become. That's why this small group of people has been one of the reasons they've been as effective as they have been. But yeah, I think that a lot of younger people, I notice, they think that they just assume, because why wouldn't they? If you graduated from, my wife was a sophomore in high school when 9/11 happened, right? And so it was a year or two of kind of hands across America, but that faded really, really fast. And there's politics ever since then has been, you're a terrorist lover. No, you're a Nazi. No, you're a commie. No, you hate America. And that's just been politics. And people who are under 35, 40 years old, they're justified in looking and just assuming it must have always been this way, right? This is just how politics is always, and it's not true. It's something that's very unfortunate that's come about in relatively recent times.
Hey, everybody. Henry David Woods, my new son, was just born. He's not named after Thoreau, by the way. I keep emphasizing that. David's my wife's grandfather's name. But after 5 daughters, I also have a son. And that son, as it turns out, is going to be the great guest star aboard the next Tom Woods cruise, August 2026. Sure, Scott Horton will be there. And sure, Clint Russell will be there. But the real star is going to be little tiny Henry David Woods, cutest kid you ever saw, and I'd sure love to have you come meet him. It's this thing, I hear people say, I don't like cruises. Doesn't matter. It's because you haven't gone on my cruise. My cruise is a million times better than any cruise you've ever been on. I host these huge games that have everybody in stitches, and this time I'm going to be I was going to hand out cash prizes, but I think I'm going to hand out silver rounds because I think you want to hold on to those. We don't have boring lectures on the non-aggression principle. Instead, we're going to have great talks from Scott and Clint and me. An exclusive performance by world-class magician Doc Dixon. Remember my 2000th episode when he sawed me in half? He also fooled Penn and Teller on their TV show. Well, he's going to be performing just for us. So everybody else on the cruise ship, stinks to be you. We got an exclusive performance by Doc Dixon. For the wives and girlfriends who might not be entirely on board, we'll have a special My Husband/Boyfriend is a libertarian, conservative, right-winger group, in case the ladies would rather have fun together. We'll have delicious dinners with friends you haven't met yet, and our speakers like Scott Horton and me will rotate from table to table each night. We'll have exciting shore excursions with me, normal people and normality 24/7. Lifelong friendships. I have people who have been sailing with me for nearly 10 years, and they've made friends they remain close to this day. Our special gatherings for night owls. Scott Horton will talk your ear off till 3 a.m. You'll have plenty of free time. Our hilarious pitch contest with the prize, a free cruise, and plenty more. Too much to list. So you got to be on board this thing. It's the best thing I've ever done. It is so much fun. You won't know how much fun it is till you go. It's like Obamacare. You have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. You got to come on board the Tom Woods Cruise. Check it out at tomwoodscruise.com. Let me read the Buchanan quotation from the article. This is Buchanan responding sometime later to David Frum. And then I want to talk about the parallels between this and today. So Buchanan says, With Iraq turning into the Mesopotamian morass some of us warned it would become, the neo-Jacobins have decided they are not going to be the ones to ride the tumbrils. In times like this, character comes through. By turning on the men they persuaded to go to war, by fabricating alibis and inventing excuses to absolve themselves of culpability for what they labored to create, they have revealed themselves for what they are: hustlers and opportunists devoid of principle, driven by an ideology of power and a passionate attachment to a nation not their own. The old right curmudgeons who warned us against giving these vagabonds food, shelter, and a warm place by the fire were right. We should have put them back out on the street. Now, what's different about 2004, when that article was written, describing this battle going on with the Frums and the Buchanans, is that now Pat Buchanan was a very prominent guy, like more prominent than any of us by a mile, many miles, because he'd been in, he'd served in 3 White Houses. He'd been a national figure running for president more than once. He was a multiple best-selling author, a newspaper columnist, TV staple. I mean, you name it. The guy was all over the place. But nevertheless, he was very much in an embattled minority on this question. And it looked like the neocons were just in the ascendancy. And even when the Iraq War went sour, they somehow still landed on their feet. I don't know how they did it. They got to hand it to them. Somehow they landed on their feet. Whereas today, even though we don't have in our ranks anybody of the stature of a Buchanan, I mean, I could be proven wrong. Maybe a Thomas Massey. I don't even know really. But suddenly today, we're not just like this fringe of 7 people they can write an article about and that's the end, and call us unpatriotic conservatives and be done with us. It seems to be the case. We've become an army of people that it's going to be very difficult to just wave away with a gesture of your hand. What do you think is different about today versus then?
Well, it's the diversity of the media environment. Well, that's a big part of it, actually. I'll get to other part of it in a second. But I mean, if you think about it, all the David Frums of the world really had to do to shut down Pat Buchanan and other great patriotic Americans who had been dedicated patriots for their entire public lives. Didn't matter. This guy, David Frum, can write this article. He's not even an American citizen. He can write this article in National Review. And Pat Buchanan's more or less excised from the conservative movement after all these decades. And they were able to do that because back then, all you really had to do was control National Review, the Heritage Foundation, Fox News, and maybe the Wall Street Journal editorial page, maybe. That's about it. That's really all you had to do. And all of a sudden, think about people like us back then. Somebody like me after my appearance on Tucker that blew up, because of the Churchill thing. Even 10, 15 years ago, they could have squashed me like a bug, no problem. Because, I mean, if I wanted to write something and get paid for it, I had to go through some large institutions and get them to actually co-sign it for me, If I wanted to go somewhere and speak on camera, other than maybe local public access television, I had to be on somebody's good list, on these few outlets that existed. And so that monopoly has been broken. And it's been broken for good, and they are scrambling hard to try to get it back. You see what happened with CBS News, with Ellison putting Barry Weiss in there, and just all of the TikTok thing, of course. They're trying really hard to get it back, but the problem with it is it's already been seen, it's already been noticed. And once it's noticed and people realize you're trying to control their speech and trying to shut them down, especially in the United States, any further attempt to do it only makes your situation worse. It just digs your hole deeper, especially with the nature of the internet. They could do all they want. They could manage to get Twitter back from Elon Musk. They could shut down Substack. They could do whatever they want. The internet will adapt and move around it. It'll flow around it like water, and there's nothing that they can do about it. And the problem is the people who are on that side of trying to set and control the narrative on that side of things. And I don't just mean the neocons in Israel. I just mean the establishment, the warmongers, all of these people in general, who have held serve, especially on the conservative side for so long. They don't know how to operate in this world, and they're panicky about it, and they're just hammering the same old tactics that not only aren't working, but that are flying back in their face every single time they try it. And I don't know if they can really adapt and change course, because, I feel like if you look at the neocons back then, they at least had a certain sense of, and maybe this is because the first generation neocons who, whether you agree with their ideology or not, a lot of them were very brilliant men with a lot of foresight and a lot of social and cultural understanding. Guys like, Norm Podhoretz versus John and Irving versus Bill Kristol. Like these were intellectually serious people, like who needed to be taken seriously. And maybe they still had more weight to throw around in the movement back in the 90s and even the early 2000s, because back then there was sort of a sense that like, yeah, David Frum can go and write this article in National Review, but it's in, sort of officious language, denouncing these people as unpatriotic conservatives or whatever. But they knew kind of back then, you don't go full Mark Levin. Nobody goes full Mark Levin, because that's just not going to work. And they had more sense back then. And today it's just like, it seems like they can't control the very worst impulses of the very worst people on their side. And not only can they not control them, they can't keep them from holding the floor and basically representing their side for the rest of the public that's viewing the whole thing. If you ask most people out there, I responded to a post from the ADL recently where they were attacking Megyn Kelly, calling her an anti-Semite. I mean,
that was such a dumb thread.
Absurd, insane, ridiculous accusation, which when you think about it, I mean, for the ADL and the people who support the ADL and give it money and, who support its work, calling somebody an anti-Semite to them is like calling somebody a pedophile. You are the worst possible thing, that you are the thing that our entire organization exists to destroy, right? It's like trying to ruin somebody, really trying to ruin somebody. Because if you make that stick the way they were able to with certain people in the first battle we're talking about with the Iraq War, they were able to make that label stick on a lot of people, and it destroyed their careers. And not only destroyed their careers, it seriously damaged even their social lives. Somebody like Pat Buchanan, people who he'd been friends with for decades, who didn't want to speak to him publicly anymore. Like this kind of thing could happen. And they're doing this to somebody like Megyn Kelly, who's never been anything but supportive of Israel. And even after they started going after her for a long time, was still very sort of moderate in her responses, hey, prefacing everything with how much she actually loves Israel. This isn't about that, da-da-da-da-da. Nothing she could do, though. And so I said to them, like, in the post that I responded to the ADL, like, look, man, you live in a diverse society and different groups of people are organized politically, socially, economically to varying degrees. How the leaders of those various groups, whether it's the leaders of the LGBTs, whether it's the leaders of the organized Jewish community, whatever it is, the people who are looked at as representing that group, are going to impact the way that people feel about that group, for better or worse. This is just the reality of the situation, right? If you have Stokely Carmichael screaming Black Power, and that's what people are seeing on TV when they turn on something about the civil rights movement, they're going to have a different view of that than if they see Martin Luther King saying we're Americans, we deserve our rights too, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the reality. And the fact that not all of X group supports that person or whatever, like that's obviously true. That's always true of any group and any leader or leadership structure ever. But when you have somebody like, like Mark Levin, Ben Shapiro, these people who their entire thing is they go out and pick fights with people for publicity. That's what they do. That's their business model, Yeah. And so when the ADL goes, after they go out and pick these fights, and the ADL, which is one of the most prominent, well-funded, prestigious, quote unquote, like on that side, like Jewish organization that exists, goes and takes their side and starts attacking the people they're attacking, fighting on their side of these fights, it does send the message that this is like what Mark Levin is saying, going out and calling Megyn Kelly a disgusting anti-Semitic fraud and like all these just horrible things, calling Miss Rachel an anti-Semite, and all these. Like, it makes it seem as if at least the institutions that are kind of recognized as representing the organized Jewish community are saying these things, that it's not just Mark Levin, this crazy elf on the radio screaming these things, that the organized community has his back. And whether or not that's true, or the degree to which that's true, is is one thing. That's how people are going to perceive it, and reasonably so. And my point in that post to them was like, take some responsibility for your role in this, you know?
Well, and in particular, the fact that you would, the Tucker Carlson thing is ridiculous and absurd, but Megyn Kelly's even more so, because Megyn Kelly is not even taking Tucker's position on things, which, by the way, I think Tucker's position on virtually everything is at least well considered. I could nitpick, but the nitpicks are healthy and good. They're not. It doesn't make him a bad guy. These would be great conversations over drinks. No big deal. But anyway, Megyn Kelly is she basically has been, as you say, an ally of that side forever, and she had some misgivings. And they could have said, look, you've been a great ally. So, we're not savages. So we're not going to just dismiss and smear you. Let's see if we can work this out and see if maybe there's a misunderstanding, or maybe we have done some things wrong that might have offended you, but we hope it doesn't affect your overall posture toward it. What just say that. Yeah. That's all they had to do, was just be normal people. Just act like that. But if you're going to condemn her as an anti-Semite, then I think there's some people who are on the fence are going to say, well, I guess there's no point even bothering trying to appease these people, because if you move 3 inches off the plantation, they call you these names.
Yeah, and they go from 0 to 100, just like
0
that.
to, yeah.
And I mean, and this is something, if you've ever had the unfortunate experience of having to spend time around a person like a narcissistic person tending toward paranoia, paranoid complex. And we all know, like, the clinical, the CIA's after me and they put a bug in my tooth kind of thing, like mental institution types. But these things, we see them in our daily lives, of friends and family members and people at work, in much more muted ways, but having sort of a similar kind of approach to other people. And one of the things that you notice as a universal with people like that is that they always suspect that even people who are their friends are probably somewhere down in there actually their enemies, and like they're really kind of waiting for the opportunity, to show it. And so as soon as there's any modicum of disagreement, man, it goes, like we just said, from 0 to 100, just like that. It's like, aha, that thing that I've always known was in there, that thing that, I've always suspected, even though I didn't have any evidence for it through these years and years and years of our relationship, that you've been perfectly nice and friendly to me, but I've always known this hatred, this thing was inside you. Now I see it. And so all of those years of you being nice to me doesn't mean anything. Now I see that was all a ruse. And this was all just a cover for the only thing that really matters in our relationship, which is your hatred for me. And, this is something that, it very often, it negatively impacts the outlook and the approach of minority rights movements, like across the board. There have been like black nationalist types who've been like this, the BLM types, very much everybody's a racist, latent racism, whatever it is, latent homophobia.
And white people are born with it, which they're now saying about anti-Semitism.
Right. And so, that's something that is always it's something that's always a threat to kind of creep into minority movements like that. But when it comes to neocons, when it comes to Zionists and Jews in general, like, you really have a lot of accelerants just kind of thrown onto the fire. One obviously is the project I'm working on right now, which is the story of World War II and the Holocaust, which is kind of the founding myth of our current global American-led, global culture now. And so that's one. They're at the center as the primary victims of like our founding cultural myth, basically, at this point in our history. That's one. But then, it's there's something that I was talking to Dave and Robbie about this, actually, when they were up here for a comedy show, and we were back in the green room talking for quite a while. And I had recently written an essay for my Substack where I had given 2 examples. One of Winona Ryder, an old an interview she had given after I think she was in the TV miniseries adaptation of the Philip Roth book, The Plot Against America, which is about, it's a Philip Roth novel where Charles Lindbergh is running for president in 1940, and like America is really kind of like becoming more Nazi and threatening this from the perspective of this Jewish family. And there was a TV series that she was apparently in, and they were talking to her about, one of the things she said is that, the things that are happening in this book, and I mean, there's pogroms, there's all murders, all these things of Jews in America, that we're at a stage right now, a point in history right now, where this is a very real possibility that this could happen. And it's like, okay, that's crazy for any person to like look at modern America and think that that's the case. But then she goes on and she says, she tells a story. She says, when I was a little girl, like 5, 6 years old, we're talking, how she wouldn't sleep in her bedroom. She would sleep in the hallway outside her parents' room with the hallway lights on because she wanted to be ready. This is a 5 or 6 year old girl because she knew without a doubt that one day, no matter how much people smile at her on the street, no matter how much her friends are nice to her at school and her teachers are nice to her at school, her friends' parents, her teachers, those people, the people that she sees every day at the market, one night they're going to kick down her door and they're going to drag her family away to murder them. This is a 5 or 6 year old girl. And it's like, okay, she didn't come up with that idea on her own.
Yeah.
Like, what is going on here? Like, this is, if you found like, if you took the political and historical context out of it and you just found a family that was putting those kinds of ideas into their child's head to the point that they can't sleep in their own room because they're so terrified of, you'd say this is abusive. I mean, this is like purposely traumatizing.
Right. And if the same thing had been done to black children, these people would be mocking them for that.
Right.
You're obviously insanely paranoid. In the United States, you think that's going to happen? What's the matter with you?
When I was talking to Dave and Robbie about it backstage, they both of them are Jewish, obviously, and they both said from their own childhood, that part of your essay was 100% dead on. And Robbie said when he was a kid for quite a long time, he was afraid to take showers because of the gas chamber stories.
Wow.
And it's like, when you take that gasoline and throw it onto this fire that all minority movements of various kinds are kind of, prone to or have a tendency to fall into, but you throw all of this accelerant on top of it, man, it helps you understand how it goes from 0 to 100. Because, even like your most hardcore BLM activists, like they don't actually think that even if somebody's racist, even if they find somebody who's like a genuine racist, doesn't like black people and proud of it, they don't actually think that guy wants to like re-enslave the black population of the United States, right? They don't actually think that. They kind of know that's not true. You talk to like not a crazy person, just you go talk to Winona Ryder, go talk to like Roseanne Barr's another story very similar to that. How her parents, forced her to watch all these really grotesque concentration camp videos when she was a little girl. And she talked about she had nightmares and weird tics and twitches for years. And like, you go ask people like that, well, this person, he doesn't like Israel. And yeah, he might even be a little anti-Semitic. To them, you want there to be another Holocaust. You want us all dead. You want my family dead. You want us all killed. And it's like, dude, slow down.
Yeah.
Like, can we just have a talk here about like the behavior of like some prominent Jewish community leaders, or like, like an adult conversation about what's going on over in Gaza and Israel or something. It's just, it's very, very difficult to find anybody that you can have that conversation with, because if they're capable of having that conversation, they're usually not on that side.
Yeah, right.
They're usually already on your side. And so it's very tough.
But they should instantly, not that they care about consistency, but they should instantly stop mocking Jasmine Crockett or whatever, like whoever these people are who are wildly over the top in their own exaggeration. They got to knock that off, because they're doing exactly the same thing. And then, well, in our case, it's true. I'm sorry that they think the same thing. No,
and it's the thing. Look, being kind of on the fringe of the right wing, I have friends and acquaintances who go way, way past the fringe, believe things that I don't believe, but they're good people and they know how to behave in public and treat people with respect. And so
that's
I
how I
don't
feel.
disown friends based on whatever crazy ideas they have rattling around in their head this week. People change.
Yeah, I mean, basically, my friends don't favor mass murder, so that's
there you go.
better than anybody in the press.
When you look at like white identitarianism, it is something like, what is it that people are, the people who have like genuine and kind of just criticisms of that, when they see it and they're sort of repulsed by it, what is it they're repulsed by? It's this version, this tendency that I'm describing in these other movements taking over there is everybody's against us, everybody hates us, everybody wants to destroy us, everybody's our enemy, and just taking that idea and really internalizing it and making that the point and the source of all the energy in your movement is very self-destructive, and it frightens other people. It makes other people step back and say, these people, I'm not so sure I want these people in charge of, making decisions that might affect me or my family's lives. That's just totally natural. And I think the fact that the Zionist cause has like suffered so much since October 7th, just in terms of public opinion, and the fact that because of the nature of Israel, just how Israel has conducted this conflict, you're talking like, I put it this way the other day, and I'm sure it's maybe like, was considered insensitive to some people, but I mean, it's just literally true. We still think about and talk about and write about Kristallnacht, the pogrom against Jews in Germany in the late 30s, like all the time. It's in every history book. It's in all these things. Dude, there's a Kristallnacht every other week in the West Bank right now, where Jewish settlers in the West Bank are attacking Palestinian villages, beating civilians, murdering civilians, burning their orchards, burning their homes. This is happening like every other week on video. And when you look at just the drone video, the drone footage of what Gaza looks like today, and you remind people that millions of people used to live in that giant pile of moonscape rubble you're looking at right there. It's natural that people are going to have questions that, in this instance, the Zionists have absolutely no answer for. If you were to go back to the Second Intifada, they don't want to talk about like how this whole situation came about in 1948 and all that. They don't want to talk about that. But in terms of the actual conflict itself, they can look and say, look, we got suicide bombs going off on school buses in the middle of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Like, we have all of this happening, like even over, like while this conflict is ongoing. And people were, especially in the aftermath of September 11th, were sort of receptive to that, to that idea, because something like a suicide bomb going off in a busy intersection was so foreign and so horrific to people in the West. But now, the Gaza conflict has just been so, it's so different. It's so overwhelmingly destructive on one side. And you have so many prominent public figures in the United States and in Israel who are not just coming out in a sober way and saying, look, war is hell, it's horrible, but these things have to be done if Israel's ever going to be safe. And, they're not doing that at all. You got Randy Fine out there who's just bathing in the blood of these children who have been killed and doing it with total glee. And you see this from Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro and all these types. And so, when you see that kind of thing, what are you going to say to the people who raise their hand and say, wait a second here, I've always kind of been pro-Israel. I visited there when I was with my church group when I was younger and stuff, thought it was great. But I'm not so sure about all this. Like, what's the explanation here? What are you going to say to those people? And the answer is they have nothing to say. There's nothing you can say that's going to satisfy them. And so instead, you just do everything you can to try to shut that conversation down before it happens. And the reason that they're so upset with people like Tucker, people like Megyn Kelly, it's not because of any specific thing that they've said. It's that people like them are giving the rest of America permission to ask these very basic questions that have been on their mind, but they've kind of, they've been sort of trained from an early age that it's a little uncouth, if not even kind of immoral, to voice these questions out loud. And that spell is being broken by people like Tucker, by people like Megyn Kelly, And thank goodness for that.
Yeah, and I made this post again on X saying that the magic number is 5. So I see somebody on that platform telling me that Tucker Carlson's a kook or whatever, this or that. So then I go over and look at that person's profile, and it takes me no more than 5 posts to realize, oh, now I see why they don't like Tucker. It's always the one issue.
100%,
They could forgive Tucker anything he says, whatever he says that they think is kooky, they could forgive that in 3 seconds as long as he would just stick with the one issue. But they're not honest enough to say that. It's always they're deeply concerned about the state of the conservative movement. Oh, yeah, these people are deeply concerned about the state of the conservative movement. Can I read something to you? This is something that you actually commented on online. There's a guy named, he goes by Fisher King on X. And I'd just like to get your thoughts about this. He says, this was back in September. He said, there is some cope about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It is not true that his murder will make us stronger. He was a unique talent in media, but also in voter turnout and registration. It's unlikely someone will achieve that same productivity. His murder made us weaker, and the left understands this in a visceral way. It's why they were celebrating in an unembarrassed way. We have to protect our top guys better. Had Trump been killed, that also would not have made us stronger. First, I think I understand why people might say that. They say that out of wishful thinking. But obviously, you take one of the most talented guys out. How would that make you stronger, right? I mean, it's not when all the the fighting age men were drafted into World War II. That did not make the U.S. economy stronger. Those GDP numbers are fake. They couldn't have been stronger with those people gone. But what do you think is the connection? Because there's obviously, I just like to hear what made it so that the death of Charlie Kirk seems to have poured accelerant on the civil war within the right. It's almost like it started then, and obviously some of that had to do with trying to dig out what was Charlie's frame of mind at the time of his death with regard to Israel. Were there really Jewish donors pulling money because of his support for letting Tucker speak?
A discussion, by the way, which came about because of Benjamin Netanyahu coming out first and basically trying to hijack the meaning of Charlie's death and make it, a justification.
He was a friend
for the
of
war
Israel
in Gaza. Yeah. And in a really grotesque way. And all of the other things about what Charlie really thought or didn't think, that kind of came after that grotesque display.
Yeah.
And that's important to remember.
Yeah, that is actually important to remember. But was that what set off this? Was this just a powder keg? What do you think?
If you go back to the late 60s, right, you have this really unprecedented nationwide protest movement that's building up into the late 60s. And it has 2 main strands. You have like the campus anti-war movement, basically, and you have the civil rights movement, the white and the black, the college educated and the Southern. And as the 60s went on and people, especially younger people, became more and more radicalized, more and more alienated from the institutions, in the case of the anti-war movement, more and more threatened by the very real possibility that they were going to be sent off into a jungle to kill people or die for something they didn't believe in or understand. And on the civil rights side, as lesser figures than Martin Luther King were assassinated, as protest marches, freedom rides, things like that, where people were getting beat down in very public ways. The younger people especially were becoming radicalized, but you had people kind of at the top of those movements who had enough gravity, enough organizational capability, enough charisma, and enough moral authority to kind of keep a lid on that as long as they were around, right? And so, the term Black Power first came about in 1966. It was Stokely Carmichael, a radical young guy who was the leader of SNCC back then. And Martin Luther King, until the day he died, was speaking out against this whole idea of Black Power. Like, you'd say Black Power, white power, like this isn't what we're trying to do. And, Martin Luther King obviously had his character flaws and stuff. Like, leave that aside. Point is, within the movement, he was against this like much more militant, much more radical and confrontational way of approaching the civil rights movement. And he had the gravitas within the movement to keep somebody like Stokely Carmichael, as charismatic and all that as he was, and as much support as the idea was starting to have, he could keep him under control. And if you go to the 1968 election, you had the campus activists, all the hippies or the anti-war people. They were all cutting their hair short, shaving their beards off. They had the Clean for Gene movement because they all wanted to go door to door in middle-class neighborhoods and campaign for Eugene McCarthy, because and they had to look the part. They couldn't show up like a bunch of dirty hippies or anti-war protesters. They had to show up to like Joe Schmo's middle-class house and be able to talk to him like somebody he respects naturally, And so they were doing this. And if you look at that, what that really means is that these two protest movements were dissident movements, they were protest movements, but on the whole, they still bought into the system. They still were sort of allowing that energy to be channeled into these sort of generally pro-social kind of channels that were part of the mainstream society in one way or another, even if they were dissident movements. 1968, Eugene McCarthy just gets completely robbed by the Democratic Party. And this is something, again, that, for the people who were part of that Clean for Gene movement, this wasn't a matter of whether you get the healthcare policy that you favor or not. This is, are you going to get yoked up against your will and sent to a jungle to kill and die? Like, this was life or death for these people. And they watched this guy get completely, blatantly, obviously robbed. And when they went and protested it at the convention, the Chicago police came out and beat the hell out of them. And then Martin Luther King gets killed that same year, in 1968 in April. And so you have those two lids that had sort of been on these protest movements got lifted off. And all of that energy goes scattering to the winds. And it was from right there. Most people think of like the Weatherman bombings and all that as sort of this phenomenon that took place across the 1960s. It didn't. The first bombing wasn't until 1969. This was something that once those lids came off and all that energy starts flowing into these weird cults and radical militant movements, from the Black Liberation Army to the Weathermen to all these others, to the Jonestown cult even, all that energy then is just freed up. And that's something that's kind of happened here. You had a guy like Charlie Kirk, who, love him or hate him in terms of like from within the conservative or right-wing side, even if you're, you were going to war with Charlie Kirk all the time, like somebody like Nick Fuentes always was, because they had disagreements about Israel and other things. It was still like there was still like he had a certain modicum of respect within the movement that you had to pay to him due to his own conduct, his own behavior. And if you weren't willing to pay that to him, your own reputation was going to suffer because of it. And so you get rid of somebody like that. And you also, I wouldn't, obviously Trump didn't get killed, but I think that, there are a lot of people who have been MAGA, all the way from 2016 through 2020, all this, who have become disillusioned over time. And so it's a few here, a few there that drop off, but over time, now it's been 10 years, you have a fairly large group of people who are or were MAGA who just think they're not satisfied with, the way that the administration and just the Trump movement in general has conducted itself. So they've kind of fallen off as well, which means that for those people, Trump being that figure, who that lid on top of things has sort of been removed as well. And so you just have a lot of people with a lot of energy going out and, the people who are on their own like that, are very vulnerable to con men, shysters, people, cult leaders, whatever. And when you look also, I think and I'll stop rambling after this, but I think another like big part of this was, when COVID hit, there were still, you go back to 2019 and, we were all on the internet and stuff, but there were a huge number of people like 40 and over in 2019, definitely 50 and over, who like grandma would go on Facebook to like her grandkids' pictures or whatever, or send them like a happy birthday meme or whatever. But it wasn't like a part of their lives. It wasn't something that they were. COVID comes along, everybody's locked in their houses for varying lengths of time, depending on where you live. And the entire country just spends all their time on the internet. And it just became the place that all of these people who it had been kind of a peripheral thing is now a major part of their lives. And for people like, I would say about our age and younger, we have enough sort of, we came into it at an early enough stage in our lives that we have some level of defense for some of the stuff that comes at you on the internet. We know how to like sift it a little bit. Man, poor grandmas and grandpas, and people's parents who started going on Twitter in 2020 and are on there doing politics all the time now. They don't know which way is up. And so you have all of these people who just are not as schooled and sort of sifting through the propaganda, sifting through the con artists and the grifters and all this, who are just fully on the internet like they're 19-year-old Zoomers or something. And and you have this weird phenomenon that never existed before, and it's creating a lot of conflict. Where, if you think about it, like, go back again, not that long ago, not the 1950s. I'm talking like 2010, and the idea that Nick Fuentes would be getting into a public fight with the head of the Heritage Foundation. That just would never have happened. It's just there was no avenue for that to happen. Nick would be over here with his young crowd, and they're talking in ways that young people talk, crass, crude, pushing boundaries, breaking, tipping over sacred cows, etc. And then you'd have the heritage people over here, and they do their thing. And, they might be paying attention to each other, but they don't talk to each other. They certainly don't fight with each other in public. And all of a sudden, you have all these people thrown into the same basket. And, you have people who run the Heritage Foundation looking at somebody like Nick Fuentes and saying, why, what's going on here? What's happening? It's like, well, actually, like, young people have always just, broken taboos and pushed boundaries, and all of the things that you think are sacred that you're trying to, force them to think are sacred as well. They like throwing that stuff back in your face. It's always been that way. This isn't something profoundly new. What's new is that now you, grandma or grandpa or head of the Heritage Foundation are going and getting into a public fight with him about it. That's just something that never happened before, And I think that's creating a lot of confusion.
As I want to, in general, I've been going like an hour lately. I started off as a half-hour thing, and then I do fewer episodes now, so I go about an hour. So I don't want to go too much farther down here. I'd like to wrap up, even though I'd love to talk to you for hours. But given that it is the beginning of the year as this comes out, and I hate being asked for predictions. I'm no good. That's why I'm a historian. I tell you about things that already happened so that I know I'm going to be right. So I hate asking for predictions. So I won't ask you for a prediction. Instead, I'll ask you for a hope. Is there something that you hope will happen in 2026 that has a greater than non-zero chance of actually happening?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I maybe this would be a little bit hard to put into like a single wish or something, but I would just say to everybody who would be watching the Tom Woods Show and anybody who follows me, that it doesn't always seem like it. But we are winning. We are 100% winning. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the 2026 election or the 2028 election or whatever is going to go our way. But the monopoly on information distribution is already shattered. The people who are trying to put it back together are fighting a futile battle. They will lose. They can only lose. And as time goes on, if we stick to the truth, what we, try to tell the truth. Obviously, you can be wrong, but don't lie. We do our best and stick to that and just be human. Then over time, we're going to continue to win. And people are going to come around and just understand like that the way that we have been conducting ourselves as a country and as a political culture for quite a long time now, but not that long in the grand scheme of things, that it doesn't have to be this way. That the idea that we just bomb a dozen or two countries every year, that's just, obviously, like, what are we going to do? Like, not bomb people? That's crazy, right? No, like, it actually was not always like that. Not that long ago. It was not always like that. And it doesn't have to be like that. We have this idea where, I've been thinking a lot about World War I lately because of where I am in the German series. And, one of the things that really came out of that war, I was talking to Scott about this last night, actually, is how, the people were looking around at the decadent, corrupt rulers of Europe who had sent just millions and millions of their of their solid citizens into these trenches to go die for nothing. And people were looking around and saying, how did this happen? Why did this, why would these people have done this to us? Like, what is going on here? And this can never be allowed to happen again. And the only people at the time who were telling a story at all, really, about who did this to you, why they did it to you and all that, was the socialist and communist movements. That's why dissidence back then was almost synonymous with socialism. People look back now and they say, well, National Socialism, that's a left-wing movement, right? It's like, no, it's a right-wing movement. It's just that back then socialists were the only ones with a counter narrative of why this old, rotten, corrupt edifice that threw us into this trash heap of a war, and has failed to lead us in a productive way out of the war, why that happened. And so everybody had to frame things in that way. And I think that when we look now, one of the things that came of that was after the war, you still had a few kings and queens of England and stuff, but really you had constitutional monarchies, and there were really no monarchs in Europe that had any power, and there haven't been to this day, real power in the way that the Kaiser or the Tsar did. And the people basically, they had their differences of ideology, but one thing that virtually everybody agreed with, right, left, and center, the traditionalist conservatives who wanted to bring back the Tsar, bring back the Kaiser, they were completely marginalized before they even got started. The thing that everybody agreed on is that we, just the people, we're going to have a say in what's going on, with the conduct of our states from now on. That's just, we're not just going to get thrown into things by people on a whim because they decide to do it. And now the reason for that, the reason that was important was so that something like World War I didn't happen again. And you could say, look, yeah, we can compete, we can do all these, you have countries that we don't necessarily get along with or whatever, but the idea that we're all just going to, millions of us, we're going to send ourselves by the millions into a war like that to just get killed. We can't allow that to happen. And so we have to have a say in how our states are run. And instead of sticking to that preventative mode, that we need to be able to make sure that our liberty is safeguarded and that our lives aren't wasted in meaningless wars that are arbitrarily chosen, instead of sticking with that sort of limiting aspect of representation, we just said, well, we're just going to kind of do the same thing that the Tsar and the Kaiser and everybody else were doing, this power politics thing, only it's going to be us, in here debating it and talking about it and deciding what to do. And it's that's crazy. That's just the idea that you're going to conduct grand politics in a traditional way where, war is just a normal and natural way of settling differences between states and stuff, but it's going to be people arguing on Twitter who are going to be setting the agenda for that or something. That's just an insane idea, And I think, again, your question was about predictions or hopes rather. Yeah. And there's a lot of reason to be hopeful that the people who are intent on controlling the way we think and what we can say are losing, and that they will lose. And unless we make some serious own goal mistakes, their defeat is inevitable. So take heart in that.
Wow. Geez, I am glad I asked that question. That is an excellent note on which to end. Check out the Martyr Made podcast, everybody, as well as join Darryl for Provoked with Scott Horton. How could that be anything but fantastic? Darryl, Happy New Year, and thanks so much.
You too, brother. Thank you.
And the other half of the Provoked podcast, Scott Horton, will be joining me on the Tom Woods Cruise this year. So check that out for the best vacation ever, TomWoodsCruise.com. I'll see you next time.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.